For the rest of this series of lecture, we're going to start with the oral cavity and then work our way down all the way towards the anus. And so now we're going to talk about the structures you find in each region of the alimentary canal, the functions of those structures, and kind of how it's coordinated. Now in this series, we're going to talk about the oral cavity. And so what we're looking at here is a mid-sagittal cut or so going through the head and neck, right? And you're looking at it from the side view. So you're looking at the right side of the head, but from the side that's cut, if that makes sense. So if you look at this here, you can see, like your hard palate, which is made of your, maxilla as well as your palatine bones. You have your uvula back here, which is an extension of the soft palate. Now these palates separate the oral cavity from the nasal cavity, right? That's why they're two separate spaces. And the uvula is this extension of the soft palate that kind of dangles down in the middle of your throat. You guys have all seen this before, right? Like you open your mouth, there's that thing that's kind of dangling down in the middle. That's the uvula. Now the function of this uvula is that when you swallow, it actually elevates, closes off the opening to the nasopharynx. That way food and digestive contents or whatever, it doesn't get up into your nasal cavity, right? But we know that sometimes that fails. Sometimes when you do swallow, things can go up through your nose. And if it's something like soda, it burns really bad. But now you guys also know sort of the idea behind, like, have you guys ever seen that where people, they'll ingest spaghetti and they'll start going, and they can like pull the spaghetti out of their nose and they can floss. Y'all ever seen that? No? Yeah, I've never seen it in person, but I've seen it on YouTube or whatever. So now you guys know the connection there, right? All you have to do is get behind that uvula, up in the nasal cavity, and there you go. It's all connected. So remember, the uvula, though, closes off the nasopharynx during swallowing. Now the tongue is a fairly large muscle, as you guys can see here, right? It's more than what you can see. A lot of the tongue makes the floor of the mouth as well, and it continues back in the mouth as well, near the pharynx. Now the tongue is one of your strongest muscles by mass, and it's involved with things like talking, as well as taste, as well as chewing and swallowing, right? So what the tongue does during chewing and swallowing for digestion is that it moves and it helps shape the food as you chew it. And what it does is it shapes that food into a nice kind of rounded, swallowable piece called a bolus. So the bolus is something that's swallowable. Now when you swallow, though, what the tongue does is the tip of the tongue elevates, it pushes up against the hard palate, and then the rest of the tongue moves that bolus back towards the pharynx. Then your pharynx constricts and then forces that bolus of food down towards the esophagus. But you guys see that there's another tube right here? That's the opening of your airway. And so you wouldn't want digestive contents going down this way, right? Because then you're talking about it's going down the wrong pipe. Like you're talking about swallowing food, but it's going into your lungs. So that's not what you want. So the way your body prevents this is you have this extra little tongue back here called the epiglottis, right? Now, it doesn't function like a tongue in the sense that it, shapes the food or helps you taste so much. There are some pain fibers on the epiglottis, so like it can be irritated, right? And that would make you cough. But the epiglottis, what it does is when you swallow, you guys, it actually depresses as the rest of your voice box, your larynx, elevates, and it closes off this little opening, if y'all can see that. So this opening right here closes off. That way the food only goes down your esophagus and not down your larynx and the rest of your airway. If that does fail, then you do have nerve fibers that are in the larynx and trachea here that can actually help mediate a cough reflex. That way you prevent the food from going down into your lungs. You know what I mean? Okay, so other things we can see here too, you guys, teeth, right? So our teeth are embedded within the bones of our cranium here, our facial bones rather. So you have the maxilla and the mandible, and those teeth are embedded. Now, the function of teeth is involved with mechanical digestion. And each tooth has kind of its own role with mechanical digestion. For instance, the incisors that you see here, these are involved with chopping food, right? So they can kind of chop it into smaller bits because they're even shaped like a chisel, right? They come to a point and they're very sharp. That's the ones you find right on the anterior side of your teeth. And then the ones next to it are the canines. And you can't really see that well here, but the canines are involved with like piercing and kind of puncturing. And then behind that, we have the premolars and molars, which have a flat surface. So those are involved with kind of mashing food. right? That way we can really grind it and mash it together. And so you think about, well, what could you eat if you didn't have certain teeth? Well, it definitely would be hard to chop food if you didn't have, your incisors. So you need to make sure that you really cut the food up into small pieces before you put it in your mouth. Because if you had to rely on your incisors to like tear off a piece of beef jerky, but you didn't have them, good luck, right? You also have your premolars and molars in the back, which are involved with grinding and mashing. So if you didn't have as many premolars and molars, it would be really difficult to eat hard foods or foods that require a lot of grinding and mashing, right? So something to keep in mind. So if we move on to the next slide here, you guys can see a different view. So here's our hard palate. Here's our soft palate. What's this little thing right here? The uvula. Good. Here's our tongue. And do you guys see that the tongue is actually anchored down on the anterior surface? So the anterior part of the tongue, it's anchored to the floor of your mouth by something called the lingual frenulum. And so this lingual frenulum keeps the tongue down. And that's a good thing, right? When it's of appropriate size, because you don't want your tongue to roll back into your pharynx because you can potentially choke on your own tongue, Like if I go back to this last picture, look how big this tongue is. And if it falls back into your pharynx, you could choke on it, right? And so what we see here is the lingual frenulum kind of helps anchor it anteriorly. That way the tongue can't fall back into your pharynx as easily. Therefore, you don't choke on your tongue, right? So you guys heard that thing when people choke on their tongue when they're having seizures? What's happening there is they're not choking on the whole tongue. What's happening is they could have bit off a piece of their tongue during the seizure because even your mandible can kind of tense up. And that piece that they bit off, like the tip of their tongue, that's what they can typically kind of aspirate and choke on, if that makes sense, right? But the lingual frenulum it plays an important role there. But what do you guys think would happen if it were too big? Like what if this lingual frenulum was so large that it held the tip of your tongue down behind your teeth? What would you have a hard time doing? Talking, that's for sure. That's why it's called being tongue-tied. Y'all have heard that before? Like being tongue-tied? Because there's a condition called ankylosing frenulum where essentially the frenulum is so large that your tongue is like held down to the floor of your mouth, and you can't talk very well. And so until they have that snipped and kind of cleaned up, with plastic surgery, it's going to be pretty difficult for those children to speak. What's also going to be difficult to do if your tongue is kind of held down? Yeah, you can't push food up, which is also involved with swallowing, right? So you won't be able to swallow as well or with that too. So, all right. So we also have labial frenulum, and like the tongue, you guys, the labial frenulum hold your lips to the rest of your face, right? That way your lips don't just kind of sag down and your teeth are exposed. Because if your teeth were exposed, you guys, and they dried out, you're more likely to get cavities that way because saliva protects against bacterial infection, right? Now, if you have chronic dry mouth because your lips are kind of pulled down and exposed because maybe the frenulum was damaged, then you're more likely to get, cavities. So you guys have ever heard of this? Maybe you've heard of this before, like with meth mouth. Meth mouth is essentially because meth causes chronic dry mouth, and on top of the fact they're probably not taking care of themselves, they get really accelerated tooth decline. So like they get really, really nasty, cavities all over from the dry mouth. So what types of teeth are these ones, you guys? Remember the ones that are sharp? The incisors, right? Incisors. And then the ones that are nearby here, canines. Good. Then you have your premolars over here. And then the last three, you guys, the back three, are the molars. Exactly. So you have first, second, and third molars. So how many teeth do you have total? Do you guys know? 32. We'll come back to that, though. Okay. So if we look at the tongue, you guys, remember the surface of the tongue has lots of these little papilla. And the function of these papilla is involved with taste. But it's also kind of rough, which allows you to grab onto food. And that's why the tongue can help mold it and shape it. Because it kind of has a rough surface, it can move that food around better, right? Now back here, it looks like there's another tongue there, you guys. That's the epiglottis. And I had a weird circumstance once happen with me where I was teaching a cadaver lab, and we had some students that came in from like another department. It was like English students coming to the cadaver lab to kind of get an introduction to the human body kind of thing, right? And what happened was the student who didn't have like a really in-depth understanding of biology, she's like, I got this thing in the back of my throat. Like, could you take a look at it and tell me what you think it might be? And she sticks her tongue out. And then right behind her tongue, there's like a second little tongue sticking up right there, right? And at first it really threw me back. What is that, right? It's like something out of Alien, or and I'd never really realized this or seen it, but apparently sometimes if you're based on the shape of your tongue and the shape of your epiglottis, you can actually see someone's epiglottis in the back of their mouth, right? And so when she stuck her tongue out, what I was seeing as a second little tongue back there was actually the very tippy top of her epiglottis. Yeah, so that was kind of interesting. And that memory is vividly burned into my brain. That's something I'll never forget. Something else you can see nearby too are the tonsils. We'll come back to the tonsils when we talk about the immune system later. So if you guys remember, we talked about how the oral cavity is where saliva drains into, right? And so saliva is made by 3 major salivary glands, but they're all paired. So you have right and left sides. So on the left side of the face, if you cut away some of the tissues, you can see things like the parotid gland. And this is a gigantic salivary gland that's over by your ear, right? And it has a duct that drains by the upper molars there. Then we also have the submandibular gland, which is right here next to the angle of your mandible. In fact, you can sometimes even kind of palpate it or feel it. In fact, I can feel mine right now. So I can feel my submandibular glands right here. These things right here on my neck are actually making saliva, which is kind of interesting. And then we also have the sublingual gland, which is right below your tongue. So you guys ever seen someone gleek before? That's where like the saliva can get forced out. And so people can do this intentionally or unintentionally. Intentionally, they can like open their mouths in some weird way and have muscles contract to force the saliva out of these glands so forcefully that it can like squirt out little squirts of saliva, which is always kind of gross to me. And I always wondered, like, whatever happened to those kids? What happened to the gleeking kids? Like, what do they end up doing in life? But back in the day, I worked as a dental assistant too, and sometimes it just would happen by accident. Like if you push on someone's mouth in just the right spot, all of a sudden saliva would like squirt out of their mouth. And you guys maybe this happened to you too. Maybe if you're like chewing some food, and sometimes you can just feel like a squirt. That could be saliva just spraying into your mouth. Now, it normally doesn't come out that way though, right? Normally, what happens is that all along the duct of the salivary glands and in the gland themselves, there's actually a little bit of smooth muscle, and it actually squeezes that saliva into the oral cavity, right? And that's mediated by your parasympathetic nervous system, which is the rest and digest division of your autonomic nervous system, right? Good. So do you guys know this? I mean, like, this is pretty cool, I think. There's a gigantic salivary gland that's way over here by your ear. That's the parotid glands. In fact, it takes up a pretty big part of your face. Your parotids do. And so if y'all ever seen like mumps, those pictures of the kids that have gigantic cheeks, what that is an infection of the parotid gland. And we don't see that nowadays because people get vaccinated, right? But if you ever seen like the old pictures before vaccines, you see these kids with gigantic cheeks. That's because their parotids were infected because of mumps, which is interesting. Now, for salivary glands, you guys, there's actually 2 types of saliva you can produce. You can produce serous and mucus saliva. Serous saliva is water and enzymes and ions and only a little bit of mucin. And then mucus saliva is essentially a lot of mucus, and mucus is a glycoprotein that's mixed with water. It's mucin. Mucin is the glycoprotein. And so what mucus is kind of a thicker, more sticky, viscous type of saliva. And the function of mucus is it acts as a binding agent, right? So let's say if you're chewing on some crackers or some bread or something, right? And you start chewing in your mouth. If you didn't have something to bind all of that material together, you just would have a loose mess of really dry material in your mouth. Good luck trying to swallow that, right? And so what we have then is mucus saliva that mixes with all that dry ingested material, and it holds it together into that lump. What do we call that swallowable piece of food? The bolus, exactly. So the bolus is that swallowable lump, but the way it can be held into a bolus is the mucus, right? Now, mucus saliva doesn't have enzymes. It's the serous saliva that does, because that's why it's called serous, by the way. Serous secretions have enzymes in them. And so the enzymes you find in serous saliva would be things like salivary amylase, which breaks down starches, and then salivary lipase, which breaks down lipids. In fact, there's ways you can test this, and one thing we used to do in this class a long time ago is we would test the effectiveness of saliva. So we'd have students like spit into a spittoon, right? And then we'd collect a big old thing of saliva and then distribute that to test tubes, and we would see how well the saliva was able to digest starch. And you can test this with iodine, so it's kind of cool. Although it was a really nasty lab too, because everyone's spitting in this jar, and like we had a huge, like something you've probably never seen in your life, but a big old thing of everyone's spit. And yeah, spit's not very clean, you guys, especially if you just ate breakfast or lunch or something. So yeah, good times. Anyways, that's probably why we don't do it anymore. Although it was a cool lab. So the parotid and submandibular glands are mostly a serous secretion, right? So that's going to be the enzymatic, watery type of saliva. But the sublingual glands are mostly mucus. That's the one that kind of binds that bolus of food together. So in terms of saliva, you guys, if it's the serous, it's mostly water. It's slightly acidic, and it's going to contain a lot of electrolytes like sodium, potassium, chloride, phosphate, and bicarbonate. You also find some enzymes in there like amylase and lipase. So what did amylase break down again? You guys remember? Starches, right? So sugars. In fact, if you guys ever put a cracker in your mouth, like the saltine cracker, if you leave it there, it will taste sweet over time. But it takes time for the amylase to break that down into simple sugars that taste sweeter, right? Lipase breaks down fats. So if y'all are eating like a fatty meal, and you kind of taste like your mouth is coated with fat, it feels kind of like slippery, but also kind of sticky at the same time. That's lipase that's breaking that down. Mucin is the binding agent, right? And then we also have metabolic wastes that are incorporated in the saliva. So things like urea, other nitrogenous wastes could actually be incorporated into your saliva so that when you swallow your saliva, those wastes are eliminated along your digestive tract. So eventually they end up in feces, right? Now, what's also really cool about saliva too, guys, is that it contains antimicrobial compounds like lysozyme, immunoglobulins like IgA. This is a type of antibody that can attack foreign microorganisms. We have defensins, which are little proteins that can effectively punch holes in bacterial membranes. And then we have cyanide compounds as well, which inhibit the electron transport chain. So in a lot of ways, saliva also protects against infection. So how does that make sense in terms of meth mouth with the dry mouth? Lack of saliva, they have dry mouths. They don't have their antimicrobial products in saliva that are protecting against bacteria. So the bacteria in the mouth go haywire, right? And I'm just giving an example of meth, right? But there's a lot of things that can cause chronic dry mouth as well, and that's important to consider because if you did have chronic dry mouth, one of the sequelae or consequences of that would be cavities. So you got to keep that in mind. So for teeth, remember they tear and grind food. So we have primary and permanent dentitions. The primary dentition is developed by age 21, so all of your adult teeth should be there by 21, right? If they're not, there's surgery for that you can have. So if y'all have seen that where people maybe have like a little chain and they have to go in, they get the chain tightened, every so often because it helps pull the tooth down. Because sometimes these teeth don't always erupt out of the bones. You have 20 deciduous teeth. Deciduous teeth are your baby teeth, right? And those start erupting between 6 and 24 months of age, and that continues to about 12 or so, or early teenage years. And then the permanent teeth are what push those deciduous teeth out. So if we look at a picture here, this is actually showing what the permanent teeth look like as they're developing within the bone, which is actually kind of cool. So if we're seeing permanent teeth still in the bone, you guys, that means that this was a child's skull. I don't know what the backstory is here, but somehow a child died, and what they did is they actually kind of cut away the bone, and you can see the permanent teeth were still developing here. And so these would be the deciduous teeth that would need to be forced out. Now, if you guys remember when you lost your teeth as a child, did they have these big old long roots on there? No, exactly. Even though they did when they were inside your bone, what happens is that as these teeth, the permanent teeth, develop, the roots of the deciduous teeth actually dissolve. And that's what makes them more loose. So when the tooth starts getting loose, it's because the roots are going away, right? And so what you end up with is just kind of like the crown or the cap of the tooth, and that's what it comes off really easily. So if you guys remember pulling your teeth out, or if you lost them as a kid, it just was kind of like this little flat thing, and there wasn't really a long root on it unless you were like really yanking on it before it was dissolved, So it's kind of interesting to just see that. I mean, look it up here, you guys. Look at this tooth developing. I mean, this is up by your eyeball. Like your eye socket would be right. You can't see in the picture, but it's right above that. Isn't it amazing how big? I mean, how far teeth develop? but it makes sense because that's the maxilla, right? And that kind of comes down and forces out the deciduous teeth. So if we look at this teeth, you guys, here's deciduous, and then here's our permanent teeth. Deciduous teeth are also called milk teeth. You guys have never heard of this before. And so it makes sense because they start to develop while the baby's still teething, right? Or, suckling on the breast. And then for the permanent teeth down here, you guys, we have a set of 4 incisors. We have a set of canines. We have 2 premolars, and then 3 molars on either side, okay? So if we just pick a side, let's just pick, like, this is the midline and go along one side. We have 2 incisors, 1 canine, 2 premolars, and 3 molars. The last molar back here is called the wisdom tooth, right? And so these things that start to erupt between age 17 and 25. Now, although they're still called wisdom teeth, I don't know a lot of like really wise 17-year-olds, you know what I mean? But but they do kind of like start to erupt later in life. The problem though is that people of Caucasian descent or just people with smaller facial bones, there's not enough room in the oral cavity. So as these third molars start to erupt, there's not space there. So it usually causes a problem in those kind of individuals. And so they might need to be removed because they can start to crowd the rest of your teeth and you get a lot of problems thereafter. So if we just look at the general structure of a tooth, we can see that it's broken down into a crown, a neck, and a root. The crown is the part of the tooth that's exposed, and that would be like the white part of the tooth. In fact, what makes the crown white is something called enamel. So enamel is this sort of acellular material that surrounds the outside of the crown. That's the white part. So if it's acellular, what we're saying here, guys, it's actually just collagen fibers and minerals. That's what the enamel's made of. So it's not really a living part of your tooth. And that's kind of a good thing because it's less prone to infection that way, right? It's also pretty hard. It's structured a lot like bone, but it's not technically bone, okay? Now if we go a little deeper, this is what's called dentin. And so dentin has all these little tubules within it, and these tubules help transmit nutrients from the pulp cavity out towards the outer layers. So for instance, the way you keep your enamel healthy is that nutrients from the living pulp cavity of the tooth get transmitted through the dentin tubules and then deposited on the outside of the tooth. And that's how the tooth can stay strong but also alive, right? So the pulp right here is the living part of the tooth. That's what's got your blood vessels and your nerves and your cells. Now, if you do have an infection in the pulp cavity, this is what's going to require root canal. Because the only way to clear out that infection, at this point at least, is to kill the tooth. So what they do is they shave off the crown, they drill out the pulp cavity, they sterilize it with like an acid, and they can fill it back in with an inert material. It kills the tooth, but it also gets rid of the infection. But because now you have a dead tooth there, it can't repair itself. So if you've ever had a root canal, it's not going to last forever because the root canal is basically you got rid of the infection, but you had to kill the tooth as a result. So it's kind of like an old tree stump, right? That old tree stump's going to stay there for some time, and it's going to stay kind of strong for a while, but because it's no longer growing or repairing itself, it will eventually fall over or crack, you know what I mean? And so with a root canal, they only last about 20 years or so. That's like the lifespan of that tooth after you get the root canal. So it's good to just avoid that altogether, because 20 years isn't that long if you think about it. You could be 40 and get a root canal at 40, and you're going to lose that tooth by the time you're 60. That's not that long. So, all right, so if you look over here on the neck of the tooth is at the gum line, and the gums kind of just help protect the tooth and cushion around the tooth as well. Now, the tooth is actually anchored to the bone by what are called gomphosal or periodontal ligaments, and they form that gomphosal joint, which holds the tooth in place. Now, when these ligaments get damaged, that's what causes the tooth to get loose, and the tooth gets blood supply from deeper blood vessels and nerve fibers, if that makes sense.